Welcome to Dark History for Sleep. Tonight we travel far beyond the myths, to the blood-soaked soil of ancient Sparta. Not the Spartan fantasy of cinema, but the brutal machinery that devoured its own children. This is not honor. This is obedience, built on fear, steel, and silence. You are born into the city of warriors, but your life, barely begun, hangs by a thread. A city elder lifts you from your mother's arms. You are naked, squirming, crying. He inspects your chest, your joints, your skull. He's not looking for beauty. He's looking for imperfection, any weakness, any hint of deformity. A stutter in the breath, a curve in the spine. If he finds it, you won't be swaddled. You'll be taken to the cliffs of Mount Taygetus and left to die, cold, alone, forgotten. This isn't murder, it's law. A Spartan life must be strong, or it is no life at all. If you survive, you belong to the state, not to your family, not to yourself. By age 7, you are torn from your home and marched to a military barracks. Here begins the agoge, the state's training system for transforming boys into weapons. There's no comfort, no softness, no warmth. You are taught to endure hunger by being starved. You are taught to fight by being beaten. You sleep on reeds. You wear one cloak, year-round. And if you cry, you are mocked, or worse, you are forgotten. Sparta doesn't raise men, it raises soldiers, and those who fall behind. They are trampled by the system, because in Sparta, survival is the first battle, and it is far from over. The agoge isn't training, it's transformation, from child to tool, from boy to blade. You are not here to learn, you are here to suffer, because to Sparta, pain is the purest teacher. Your first lesson is hunger. You are fed just enough to survive, and encouraged to steal the rest. But if you are caught, you are beaten, not for stealing, but for failing. This is the logic of the agoge. Only those who hide their pain deserve to live. There are no toys, no stories, no comfort. Your body is bruised daily, by peers, by instructors, by the system itself. Fights are encouraged, wounds are ignored, tears are punished. Your voice lowers not from age, but from silence. Older boys are assigned to you. They act as mentors, guards, sometimes as owners, because part of the agoge is submission to the state, to violence, to hierarchy. You must learn to obey without hesitation, to kill without remorse, to die without protest. And always, the eyes of Sparta are on you. A teacher watches you limp. He adds weight to your burden. You flinch at the cold. He strips your cloak. You show mercy. You are isolated, because mercy is weakness, and weakness contaminates. Even your friendships are shaped by brutality. You trust your brothers, but only because you've seen them bleed. You bond in pain. You joke in scars, but never let your guard down, because in Sparta, even a friend can become your executioner. You've survived the beatings, the hunger, the cold, but now the agoge demands more, not endurance, not obedience, but blood, because in Sparta, you don't graduate by reading or writing. You graduate by killing. It's called the cryptia, a secret rite, a ritual of dominance, a test of silence and cruelty. You are sent into the countryside, alone, cloaked, armed with a dagger. Your target, not an enemy soldier, not a criminal, but a Helot. The Helots are Sparta's slave class, conquered peoples, broken by generations of terror. They grow your food, clean your filth, build your walls, and once a year, Sparta declares war on them, officially. So that murder isn't just allowed, it's encouraged. Your mission is simple. Kill one Helot without being caught. A farmer, a servant, a father, It doesn't matter. They are tools, property, and this ritual reminds them, and you, who holds the blade. You stalk through the dark, you hear breathing, you wait, and when the moment comes, you strike, fast, silent, final. There is no glory, only silence, and the warm sting of blood on your fingers. If you fail, you disappear. Some boys don't come back, and no one speaks their names. The cryptaya is not about strength. It's about transformation, because now you know what it means to kill. And more importantly, you know you can. You've passed the cryptaya. The city welcomes you as a man, but not as an individual, because there are no individuals in Sparta. Only warriors, only tools. You now belong to the Syssitia, a military mess hall, your new home, your new family. Meals are shared with your unit, meat, black broth, barley bread, all earned through hardship. But this is not fellowship. It is discipline in disguise. You sleep in barracks, you train daily, you march constantly. Every moment of your life is engineered for war, and yet, Sparta is not at war with Athens, not with Persia. Sparta is at war with its own underclass. The Helots outnumber you 7-1. You fear them, despise them, but mostly, you control them with violence, with surveillance, with public executions meant to remind them you are not human, you are owned. You raid Helot villages, destroy crops to keep them dependent, rape daughters to break their families, torture suspected rebels for information that doesn't matter, because fear is more effective than truth. Every year, Sparta stages mass purges. Some Helots are chosen at random, their throats slit at night, their bodies dumped in fields. It's not justice, it's not war, it's management. The Helots live in terror. But so do you. Because if they rise, if they ever rise, they will drown Sparta in blood. And you know it. From the outside, Sparta looks unbreakable. Iron-willed warriors, unshakable unity. A society where every man is a soldier, and every soldier is a god of war. But inside the walls, something is rotting. Not the bodies, not the Helots, the system itself. Spartan society runs on fear, but fear isn't stable. It's exhausting. It's corrosive. And slowly, it begins to eat away at everything Sparta claims to be. Power is concentrated in the hands of a few old men, the Gerousia, a council of elders who control the laws, the punishments, the future. They fear innovation. They fear change. So they outlaw luxury, philosophy, travel. They call it tradition, but it's really a prison. Sparta doesn't evolve. It calcifies. The outside world, thriving, inventing, questioning, leaves Sparta behind. Meanwhile, the warrior class shrinks. Each war takes more lives. Each generation grows smaller. Land ownership concentrates. Wealth hoards. Equality, once a Spartan myth, collapses. By the 4th century BCE, only a few hundred true Spartiates remain. The rest, perioikoi, free but powerless, Helots, enslaved and angry. Sparta still marches, still trains, still kills, but its heart is brittle. Because behind the bronze and blood, it forgot how to live. For decades, Sparta looked inward, suppressing Helots, enforcing discipline, training for wars that hadn't yet come. But now the storm breaks. Athens rises, trade booms, democracy spreads, and Sparta responds not with diplomacy, but with the only tool it trusts, war. The Peloponnesian War begins. Sparta versus Athens, land versus sea, oligarchy versus democracy. It lasts nearly 30 years, an entire generation born into war, raised by it, ruined by it. Sparta wages a campaign of sieges, starvation, and betrayal. They burn farms, slaughter allies, align with Persia, once their sworn enemy, just to cut off Athenian supply lines. Victory comes not through heroism, but through attrition. Athens falls, its democracy collapses, and Sparta stands triumphant. But the cost is staggering. Cities destroyed, alliances shattered, resources drained, and Sparta, now a superpower, finds itself ruling over people it never understood. Other Greek states begin to resent Spartan dominance. They remember the purges, the betrayals, the brutal occupation of former allies. Resistance brews. Even within Sparta, victory feels hollow. The Helots grow bolder, the population shrinks, and young Spartans, tired of endless war, begin to question the code. Quietly, privately. But the cracks are there. The war that was supposed to secure Sparta's legacy has only hastened its fall. Because you cannot conquer forever, and you cannot rule through fear without eventually fearing your own people. The battlefield is quiet now. The smoke has cleared. The bodies are buried. But Sparta is already dying, not with a bang, but with a silence too heavy to ignore. The Helots, oppressed for centuries, begin to resist more boldly. They poison wells, sabotage tools, spread whispers of rebellion. Sparta cracks down harder, but each act of violence makes the grip slip further. You can't enslave a nation without turning your back on your own soul. Other Greek cities rise up. Thebes, once an underdog, now becomes a mortal threat. At the Battle of Leuctra in 371 BCE, Sparta suffers the unthinkable, a total military defeat. Hundreds of Spartiate warriors, the elite ruling class, killed, not just a loss, an extinction. For a society built entirely on supremacy, defeat is existential. They can't replace the dead. They don't have the numbers, and the young no longer believe in the old system. They follow orders, but not with faith, not with fire. Economically, Sparta collapses. There is no trade, no innovation, no colonies. Their wealth is in land. And that land is worked by people who dream of vengeance. The state becomes paranoid. More surveillance, more purges, more executions. But it's not enough. Sparta cannot grow. And what doesn't grow dies. Sparta no longer rules. It doesn't even resist. It fades into memory, into myth, into irrelevance. But not before it becomes something worse, a cautionary tale. By the 3rd century BCE, Sparta is barely a shadow. Its once feared army, gone. Its rigid laws, broken. Its society, fractured. Only its name remains, whispered in history, carried by foreigners who never knew the rot beneath the bronze. Visitors from Rome arrive. They marvel at the ruins. They hear tales of Leonidas, Thermopylae, of unbeatable warriors. They don't hear about the Helots, or the infanticide, or the starvation and systemic cruelty, because the truth doesn't make a good story. And Sparta needs to become a story now, because its reality is too ugly to remember. The last Spartans abandon the agoge. They chase wealth, marry for power, forget the code. But it's too late. Their legacy is already being rewritten by poets, by kings, by fascists centuries later who will use Sparta as a symbol of strength, without understanding the cost. You walk through the ruins, dust, columns, broken stone, no shield wall, no voices, just the weight of memory. Of a society that tried to build immortality on the backs of slaves and the blood of children, and failed. Sparta's silence is louder now than its war cries ever were. There are no drums, no chants, no bronze marching in unison, only dust, only stories, and ruins that lie to those who never knew the truth. The Gerousia, once feared as lawmakers, is gone, replaced by Roman governors who laugh at the laws they once enforced. The Ephors, 5 shadow rulers, reduced to ceremonial puppets, their power shattered, their decisions meaningless. The agoge, the brutal forge of Spartan men, dismantled. No more rites of starvation, no more state-sanctioned murder. The cryptia becomes a rumor, a story to scare children, a fiction buried in real blood. Spartan identity itself fractures. Are they warriors, citizens, spectacles? Tourists come to see the bones of heroes, but the people who remain are not their ancestors. They are renters in a burned-out home, clinging to a name that has long since lost its meaning. And the Helots, they vanish too. No revolution, no liberation, just slow erosion. Their names lost, their languages suppressed, their graves unmarked. Because when an entire class is silenced for centuries, history forgets them by design. By the time of the Roman Empire, Sparta is a myth with real stones, a stage set with no actors, a hollow shell that once devoured its young and called it honor. You are a Spartan, but your body is not your own. From birth, the state judged it. As a child, it was beaten. As a teen, it was weaponized. Now, as an adult, your flesh belongs to Sparta. Your bones are property. Your breath is strategy. There is no privacy, no sanctuary, not even in love. Marriage in Sparta is a transaction, not of affection, but of function. At age 30, you're allowed to marry. But even then, you don't live with your wife. You sneak out to visit her in secret, cloaked in darkness, as if romance were treason. Why? Because the state fears softness. It fears attachment. It fears any bond stronger than your loyalty to war. Your wife is not yours either. She too belongs to the state, expected to produce strong sons, judged by her womb, by her body's efficiency. If she cannot bear children, another man is chosen. If you're too weak to father a child, another man is assigned your wife. Love has no place here, only function. This isn't society, it's breeding, and you are livestock in a machine that calls itself a nation. Even intimacy is invaded. You are monitored, instructed, watched, because every heartbeat not given to Sparta is considered betrayal. The irony is cruel. You train for freedom, you fight for liberty, and yet you've never had a choice. You are not free. You never were. You just believed the armor made you strong when really it was a cage. Spartan women were not meek. They were not passive. They were not soft. But they were not free either. Because like the men, they belonged to the state. In body, in purpose, in silence. From the moment a girl could walk, she was trained to be strong. Not for war, but for birth. She ran races, threw javelins, wrestled other girls. Why? To bear strong sons, to build soldiers, to replicate the machine. Their bodies were public property, their value measured by womb, waist, and will. Marriage came by order, sex came by ritual, and if a man couldn't produce a child, the state reassigned the task. Spartan women were told they were equals, but they owned no decisions. They served one role, manufacturers of Spartans. And yet, they were feared by other Greeks, by their own husbands. Because in a world ruled by violence, women who survived without protection became something rare, dangerous, sharp-tongued, independent, unapologetic. But even that power was granted, not earned. A leash is still a leash, even if it's longer than the rest. They couldn't vote, couldn't lead, couldn't mourn too loudly when sons died in war. Only one phrase was acceptable: return with your shield, or on it. No tears, no questions, no freedom. Just strength. The kind that breaks the spirit quietly over generations. While Spartan boys trained and Spartan girls were molded, there was another class, living beneath both. The Helots, not citizens, not foreigners, not even slaves in the traditional sense. They were something worse, owned people who still looked like neighbors. The Helots were native, conquered centuries earlier. Messenian farmers turned into permanent servants. They were not bought. They were broken by war, by fear, by the unrelenting machinery of the Spartan state. Every field a Helot plowed, fed a Spartan mouth. Every home a Helot cleaned, shined a Spartan name. Every punishment a Helot endured, sustained a Spartan illusion that they were gods, that they were born superior, when in truth they were parasites. Helots couldn't marry freely, couldn't travel, couldn't own land. They were whipped annually as a reminder of their status. No crime needed, just existence. Some were forced to get drunk in public as cautionary examples for Spartan youth. Not even their dignity was theirs to keep. When every day was survival, the sun rose with labor, the moon fell with fear, because at any moment, without reason, a dagger could find their back. A visiting youth, a bored soldier, a state purge. It didn't matter. No one would ask why. No one would be punished. Because in Sparta, Helot lives were seasonal, tilled, used, discarded. And still they endured whispers in the dark, secret rituals, hidden blades, waiting for the moment Sparta would slip, and they could rise. You can only hold a boot to someone's neck for so long before they bite. The Helots were silent, but they were not still. Every humiliation, every lash, every murder was remembered. And one day, Sparta made a mistake. It showed weakness. But in 464 BCE, the earth shook. A massive earthquake leveled Sparta. Homes collapsed, temples fell, warriors died, thousands of them. The agoge was in ruins. The army was in disarray, and beneath the rubble the Helots saw an opportunity. They rose. It wasn't a riot, it was a war. Helot villages banded together. They seized weapons, fortified the countryside. They weren't slaves now. They were an army. Sparta panicked. They begged for help from their own enemies, Athens. The humiliation was total. For 10 years, the rebellion burned. Spartans laid siege to Helot strongholds, but could not break them easily. This wasn't just a fight. It was a reckoning. Every scream in the night, every purge, every life stolen for centuries, now screamed back. Eventually, Sparta crushed it, but not without cost. The fear never left. From that point on, the oppression intensified, surveillance increased. The Cryptia returned with more bloodlust, because now the Helots weren't just labor. They were a threat. And Sparta, the city that claimed to fear nothing, began to fear its own foundations. Sparta was not built for peace. Its laws didn't account for it. Its people didn't understand it. In a land where war was life, the absence of war became a curse. No battles to fight, no enemies in sight, only silence. And silence breeds thought. And thought, in Sparta, was dangerous. Without an outside enemy, the state turned inward. And what it saw terrified it. Dissent, decay, disobedience in the eyes of the young. The elite began purging their own. Citizens accused of un-Spartan behavior were exiled, silenced, or executed. Some wore jewelry, some read too much, some simply asked, why? That was enough. Even the ephors, the 5 officials elected annually to oversee Spartan life, became paranoid tyrants. They spied on households. They censored speech. They scrutinized children's games for signs of softness. Fear of Helots grew, so the Cryptea became more active. Boys sent out not just to kill, but to terrorize. Families watched sons vanish, fields burned in secret, Helot songs silenced overnight. And yet, despite the terror, nothing stopped the rot. The citizen population kept shrinking. The elite hoarded land. The poor grew poorer, and the warrior ideal became a ghost, recited in training halls, but rarely seen in flesh. Sparta, once a machine of unity, became a fractured fortress of suspicion. Its walls still stood, but inside every citizen lived as if surrounded. Not by enemies, but by one another. Sparta was no longer a superpower, but it refused to admit that. Instead, it wrapped itself in shadow, clinging to its legend long after the truth had died. Statues still stood, songs still echoed, the agoge still beat boys into submission. But it was hollow. The citizens were fewer, the warriors softer, the victories gone, and so the stories got louder. Every child was taught of Thermopylae, of Leonidas and the 300, but not of the bribes, or the betrayals, or the allies who bled beside them and were forgotten. They spoke of discipline, but ignored the corruption. They praised honor, but silenced dissent. They turned history into scripture and burned anything that didn't fit the myth. Even the elders began to believe the lie, that Sparta had once been perfect. That decline was not their doing, but the fault of outsiders, softness, or fate. This denial became policy, and the more they clung to the past, the faster the future abandoned them. Rome came. They spared Sparta, not out of respect, but out of pity. They saw a society already dead, kept alive only by tradition and propaganda. In time, Sparta became a museum of itself. Tourists came to watch mock battles. Children trained for no real war. Rituals were performed for foreign eyes. It was no longer a city. It was a costume, a shell that once housed terror. Now, just another echo. Sparta didn't just die. It was reborn. But only as a myth, not a place, a symbol. One that empires, ideologues, and nations would steal, reshape, and worship. A mask for their own violence. It began with the Romans. They adored Sparta's discipline, its simplicity, its cruelty. They turned it into a political fairy tale, a mirror for their own ambition. Later, Renaissance thinkers romanticized Spartan austerity, not knowing they were praising a culture built on slavery and silence. By the 20th century, Sparta was no longer history. It was propaganda. Fascist regimes from Italy to Nazi Germany invoked the Spartan model: strong youth, militarized education, obedience above thought, fear disguised as unity. They didn't see the Helots. They didn't want to. Because for them, Sparta wasn't about truth. It was about power. And the myth of perfect warriors was too useful to abandon. Even modern pop culture plays along. Films paint Spartans as noble, heroic, righteous, their enemies dehumanized, their violence sanitized. But the real Sparta was not a place of freedom. It was a prison made of discipline and blood. And every time the myth is repeated, the reality is buried deeper, along with the victims. You don't remember the Helot's name. You don't remember the girls who were assigned like cattle. You don't remember the boys who died in the cold because their cries were too human. You remember the armor, the muscles, the glory, because the lie is louder than the grave. Strip away the legend, the spears, the crimson cloaks, the last stands. What remains? A city obsessed with control, with the elimination of emotion, with the removal of mercy. Sparta wasn't built for greatness. It was built for survival, but only for a few. Everyone else, helots, perioikoi, dissenters, mothers, unwanted children, were expendable. Its greatest myth was that all Spartans were equal. But the truth, even among citizens there were castes. Some had land, others had none. Some wore armor, others wore chains. The few at the top cloaked their fear in ritual and named it law. They taught boys to kill, called it honor. They taught girls to bear, called it duty. They crushed rebellion, called it peace. Sparta is remembered for its strength, but strength without compassion is just cruelty. It feared change, feared thought, feared love. And when the world changed, Sparta shattered. So what was Sparta, really? A mirror, held up to humanity's darkest instincts, a warning that discipline without justice is tyranny, that tradition without questioning becomes a cage, that fear, when worshipped, becomes legacy. You would not survive Sparta, but Sparta would not survive you either, because to live is to feel, to question, to change. And in Sparta, that was the first thing they killed. Sparta fell. But the idea of Sparta never died. It's still with us. In every speech that praises discipline over compassion, every flag waved for strength without justice, every institution that breaks people and calls it tradition. The myth is powerful because it's simple. Heroes, sacrifice, victory through pain. A world where doubt is weakness, where unity is enforced, where difference is crushed in the name of survival. It appeals to fear, to ego, to the desire to belong to something strong, even if it kills you. Military academies study Spartan tactics. Politicians reference Spartan values. Fictional universes borrow the aesthetic, but rarely, so rarely, do they speak of the Helots, of the purges, of the mothers who had no say, because acknowledging that side of the story complicates the fantasy, and fantasies are useful. Sparta has become a myth of control. It tells rulers what they want to hear, that cruelty can be righteous, that obedience is sacred, that domination is noble. But history has a body count, and Sparta's is enormous. We just stopped counting the bones. So remember this, Sparta isn't just a chapter in a textbook. It's a story we still tell, and still believe when it suits us. But belief without truth is how the cruelty begins again. Sparta collapsed, but it didn't vanish. It echoed. Across empires, across ideologies, into the bones of nations, still learning the wrong lessons. The shield may have fallen, but its weight pressed on long after the war drums stopped. When Sparta fell to irrelevance, Rome preserved it as a warning and a weapon. They admired its discipline, but not its cruelty. They visited its ruins, but wouldn't rebuild its laws. They used Sparta's myth to lecture their own citizens about duty, as if sacrifice were enough to keep a nation alive. Then came the Renaissance. Scholars rediscovered ancient texts. They found the poetry of Athens, the empire of Rome, and the rage of Sparta. But they misunderstood, or maybe they chose not to understand. They spoke of Sparta's equality. Ignoring the slaves, they praised its military schools, ignoring the dead boys. They romanticized discipline without confronting its violence. By the 19th century, nationalists across Europe clung to Sparta like scripture. In Germany, in Britain, in the American South, they invoked Spartan ideals to justify imperialism, racial hierarchy, and militarized youth. Sparta had become a language of control. It was no longer about history, it was about power. And every lie told about Sparta's glory was another mask hiding the blood underneath. In the 20th century, Sparta became more than a myth. It became a blueprint, not for democracy, not for freedom, but for regimes that believed cruelty was sacred and obedience was salvation. Fascist Italy, Nazi Germany, Francoist Spain. Each borrowed from Sparta. Each claimed to restore a lost greatness. They didn't care about the truth, only the image. Sparta trained boys to kill. So would they. Sparta raised women to breed soldiers. So would they. Sparta silenced dissent. They would do worse. In Nazi Germany, Hitler praised Sparta explicitly. He admired how it maintained racial purity, how it enslaved an underclass, how it lived for war. He called the Helots a lesson in eternal subjugation. He wanted the same for those he saw as lesser: Jews, Slavs, Roma, people meant to serve or be erased. In their eyes, Sparta was not a fallen state. It was an ideal and a justification for death camps, for sterilization, for education systems built on pain. They didn't learn from Sparta's fall. They built upon it. Even their aesthetics echoed ancient militarism: straight lines, sharp uniforms, youth formations marching in step. Discipline became identity, love became weakness, war became cleansing. They wore the armor, but not the soul, because Sparta had no soul left to borrow. And the world watched. Some cheered, some stayed silent, some died. But history again was weaponized, and the Spartan lie killed more people in the 20th century than it ever did in antiquity. The swords have rusted, the empire has crumbled, the city lies in ruins. But Sparta is still alive, not in stone, but in stories, and stories shape nations. Today, Sparta lives on in uniforms, in training manuals, in slogans about toughness and sacrifice. Military academies reference Spartan endurance. Politicians praise Spartan simplicity. Popular films turn Spartan warriors into avatars of glory. But the problem isn't admiration, it's amnesia. We remember the spears, not the whips. We remember the 300, not the 200,000 helots they stood upon. We remember the discipline, not the fear it bred. Across modern militaries, Spartan ideals shape doctrine. Break down the individual, build the unit, suppress emotion, reward aggression. It creates strength. But at what cost? How many soldiers carry trauma because they were trained to feel nothing? How many societies break their citizens in the name of security? Even school systems echo Sparta. Tests over questions, uniformity over curiosity, punishment over understanding. We breed obedience. We discourage doubt. And we call it excellence. Sparta teaches one thing, repeated over and over: be strong or be erased. But real strength, the kind that survives, comes from questioning. And Sparta never did that. Sparta didn't fall in battle. It withered. No grand war, no final rebellion, no last heroic stand, just silence, and then nothing. By the 2nd century BCE, Rome had absorbed all of Greece. Sparta, once feared, was reduced to a curiosity. Roman travelers came not for alliances, but for amusement. They watched young Spartans reenact the agoge. Tourists in togas applauding staged beatings. Ritual had become performance. Discipline had become theater. The city no longer led, it entertained. Its population dwindled. Its citizens no longer trained for war. The elite intermarried with foreigners. The helots slowly disappeared, either freed, killed, or forgotten. What remained was a name, a brand, a hollow identity passed down like a costume. The ruins were still impressive, but ruins always are. They speak in grandeur, but never in grief. No inscription tells you how the slaves lived, how the mothers grieved, how the boys screamed before they were warriors. Sparta left behind no literature, no philosophy, no art of the soul, just spears, graves, and fear. And so it faded. A city that once dominated the Peloponnese, now a side note in Roman records. The world moved on, but the myth waited. Because myths are patient, and when power needs a mask, it reaches for armor. Sparta's greatness wasn't built on strategy, or culture, or brilliance. It was built on control, brick by brick, law by law, lash by lash. Sparta engineered its society like a siege engine pointed inward. The rules were simple. Boys belonged to the state. Girls belonged to childbirth. Helots belonged to the soil. Emotion is weakness. Deviation is treason. Every relationship, every meal, every ritual was state-supervised. You couldn't eat with your family. You couldn't cry at funerals. You couldn't ask why. Your bed, your clothes, even your haircut was policy. They taught you to report your neighbors, to punish without hesitation, to kill without doubt. Because a society that worships strength must teach fear first. Not just fear of enemies, fear of each other. The Cryptia made sure of it. Teenagers turned assassins, roaming at night, killing helots at random, no trial, no oversight. It was called training. It was also terrorism. But here's the irony. The more Sparta enforced control, the more fragile it became. Each law made the system tighter until it couldn't breathe. Every citizen became a prisoner. Every reformer was seen as a traitor. Every outsider was a threat. No room to adapt, no way to evolve. Just stone, just steel, and eventually, just dust. Sparta feared failure, so it feared change, and in doing so, it killed its own future. No poets, no philosophers, no scientists, no dreams, just drills. While Athens built ships, wrote plays, debated democracy, Sparta repeated the same laws, the same punishments, the same structure for centuries. It worked, until it didn't. The world evolved, trade expanded, diplomacy deepened, weapons changed. But Sparta, still swinging bronze, still starving its youth, still believing fear was the only glue that held people together. They banned gold and silver coins. They avoided foreign influence. They mocked innovation. Progress was heresy. And then the numbers began to shrink. By the 3rd century BCE, Sparta had only a few hundred full citizens left. Land was concentrated into a few elite families. The agoge was failing. Even the helots were harder to control. Reformers tried. Some were noble, others desperate. They were exiled, assassinated, silenced, because Sparta couldn't imagine a world that didn't revolve around itself, even as that world left it behind. No invention, no cultural legacy, no adaptation. Sparta died the way it lived, rigid, isolated, alone. Sparta didn't just control bodies. It carved into the mind, not with philosophy, not with introspection, but with silence and repetition and pain. From age 7, you were taught one lesson. You are not a person. You are a weapon. You don't speak freely. You don't cry. You don't question. You endure. The agoge beat emotion out of boys the way a blacksmith hammers flaws from iron. But unlike iron, a human soul cracks. Some became cold. Others shattered silently. Those who broke completely were discarded, or worse, turned into examples. Even friendship was weaponized. You were encouraged to form bonds, but only to strengthen loyalty to the state. Mentorship often blurred into control. Love had rules. Attachment had conditions. Because if you cared for something more than Sparta, you were dangerous. For girls, it was no better. You were raised to be strong, but not for yourself. You were told you had freedom, but only within strict, invisible lines. Your strength was state-approved, your body state-owned. And for the Helots, life wasn't just hard, it was psychological warfare. You were reminded daily that you were subhuman, told by action, by silence, by blood. This wasn't discipline, it was systemic dehumanization, and no society can survive when everyone is taught to suppress what makes them human. Sparta didn't fall to invasion, it fell to itself, not in one moment, but in many small fractures, ignored until the city was hollow. By the 3rd century BCE, the population crisis could no longer be denied. There weren't enough full citizens to field armies, to maintain order, to keep the lie alive. Land was hoarded by a few families. The majority were poor, powerless, or caught in the contradictions of a system that demanded strength, but allowed no mobility. Reformers rose, Agis Thathorn, Cleomenes III, Nabis. Some tried to redistribute land, some tried to restore the agoge, some tried to break the chains of wealth and class, and all were met with resistance, violence, assassination. Sparta couldn't evolve because its identity was tied to stagnation. To admit failure meant shattering the myth, and the myth was the only thing they had left. Outside, the world changed fast. Macedon, Rome, economic alliances. Sparta clung to its spears while others built empires on diplomacy and trade. It didn't understand money, didn't trust foreigners, didn't believe in compromise, so it withered. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. A city once feared, now begging for relevance, reduced to ceremonial laws and empty traditions. Sparta is dead, its walls collapsed, its people scattered, its language faded. But the idea, that lived on, not as a cautionary tale, but as a blueprint. Because we didn't learn the right lesson. We didn't ask, how could a society so ruthless die so quietly? We asked, how can we copy their strength without showing the weakness? So Sparta's legacy was edited, the slavery erased, the repression ignored, the cruelty reframed as courage. And that's the danger of myths. They outlive their consequences. They inspire movements, militaries, governments. They teach boys to silence pain and men to fear emotion. They turn nations into fortresses, proud, rigid, doomed. Sparta should be remembered as a warning, but instead it became a mirror, and some still see greatness in the reflection. Because it's easier to praise strength than to examine its cost. It's easier to chant, with your shield or on it, than to ask what the war is really for. It's easier to wear the armor than to admit you don't need it. Sparta is gone, but we never stopped building Spartas. They're just harder to see, not cities, not armies, but systems, ideologies, institutions, expectations. We still reward silence. We still mistake obedience for strength. We still fear softness. In men, in children, in nations. We still teach survival by teaching suppression. The Spartan ideal lives in boot camps, in corporate boardrooms, in classrooms that crush creativity for the sake of conformity. It lives in the pressure to never show weakness, to never ask for help, to never feel too much. Because somewhere along the way, we decided that to feel was to fail. We see it in gender roles, men taught to endure, never express, women told to be strong, but only in service to others. The myth of the Spartan mother, proud to give her sons to war, silent when they die, still echoes. We see it in politics, authoritarian leaders praising discipline, order, unity at all costs, crushing dissent, controlling thought, declaring enemies where there are only questions. They don't quote Sparta, but they wear its ghost like armor. Sparta wasn't the only brutal society, but it may be the most romanticized, and that makes it the most dangerous. Every culture tells stories about itself, and the ones we repeat reveal what we value and what we ignore. Sparta's story is no different. In movies, Spartans are warriors of freedom. But freedom for who? Not the Helots, not the dissenters, not the children who didn't survive training. In video games, Sparta is a skin you can wear, a set of armor, a shortcut to badass without the burden of history. In schools, the Battle of Thermopylae is painted as noble sacrifice, but the cost, the slavery, the executions, the hollowed-out culture, is glossed over. We like our heroes clean, uncomplicated, wrapped in victory. We don't want to know that the spear was sharpened on the back of a slave. And so the myth grows, each retelling smoother, each omission deeper, until the real Sparta is just an outline filled in by fantasy. But there's a danger in clean stories. They become templates. They shape the next generation's idea of what greatness looks like. And if greatness always means conquest, control, and silence, then the world will keep building new Spartas and new graves. In the ancient world, Sparta told its own story. Now, others tell it for their own ends. Military recruiters invoke Spartan courage. They show the shield, the discipline, the brotherhood. They do not show the cruelty that kept it alive, the people who bore the cost. Politicians praise Spartan unity. They speak of sacrifice, of dying for the homeland. They do not speak of the way dissent was erased, of the lives crushed for the sake of order. Advertising borrows the aesthetic, the spears, the armor, the grit, to sell everything from sports gear to energy drinks, strength without context, power without responsibility, history stripped for style. The problem isn't admiration, it's selective memory. When you take the imagery of Sparta and remove the oppression, you turn tyranny into inspiration. And so the myth keeps recruiting, not just soldiers, but mindsets, people ready to obey without question, to see enemies in neighbors, to value dominance over compassion. This is Sparta's truest survival, not in ruins, not in history books, but in the ways we still think power should look. The most dangerous thing about the Spartan myth isn't the battles, it's the morality it sells. The idea that cruelty can be noble, that suffering is proof of worth, that mercy is weakness. Sparta taught this to its citizens. The agoge wasn't just training, it was moral conditioning. If a Helot begged for their life, ignoring them was strength. If a child cried in the cold, ignoring them was discipline. It's a way of thinking that makes injustice feel righteous, that turns empathy into betrayal. And once that seed is planted, it can grow anywhere, in any century. Modern leaders still plant it. They tell you to be strong when they mean obey. They tell you sacrifice is noble when they mean sacrifice for me. They drape their demands in honor, just as Sparta did, and people follow, because no one wants to be called weak. The danger is simple. Once you accept that cruelty is honorable, you'll accept it anywhere, against anyone, and history will repeat itself. Not because we forgot, but because we chose to remember only half the truth. Sparta's shadow doesn't just haunt history books. It stalks modern battlefields. The idea of the noble fight, the hopeless stand against overwhelming odds, still inspires soldiers, politicians, and nations. But noble for who? And at what cost? Governments invoke the Spartan spirit to rally citizens to war. They promise glory. They promise immortality in memory. They do not mention the graves, the maimed, the civilians caught in the fire. Economic powers use the same rhetoric. Sacrifice for the greater good. Endure the hardship. Stand united. But when the hardship ends, it's rarely the people who sacrificed who reap the reward. In both war and peace, Sparta's myth is a tool. It demands suffering without question. It erases the humanity of the enemy. It wraps conquest in the language of duty. And here's the cruel truth. It works. It worked in 480 BCE. It works now. Because the Spartan ideal doesn't just glorify strength. It glorifies dying for someone else's cause. And as long as people believe that's the highest honor, there will always be leaders ready to spend lives like coins. If Sparta was so cruel, so brittle, so doomed, why do we still admire it? The answer is uncomfortable. We love clarity. Sparta offers a world with no gray areas, friend or foe, strong or weak, obedient or dead. It's simpler than the messy truth of real life, and simple stories are easier to believe. We love certainty. In Sparta, the rules never change. You know your place, you know your role, you know what's expected. For some, that predictability feels like safety, even if it's a prison. We love heroes. The 300 at Thermopylae became legend because they died in a way that made survival seem small. We tell that story again and again because it makes us feel noble just for remembering it. And most of all, we love strength, even when it's brutal, even when it's built on suffering, even when it collapses, because strength looks good from a distance. You can't see the cracks in the armor until you're close enough to feel the cold of it. That's why the myth endures, not because it's true, but because it's useful to leaders, to armies, to anyone who wants loyalty without question. And as long as the myth serves power, it will never die. Let's take away the red cloaks, the shields, the hero speeches. Let's look at Sparta without the story. A city where children were property, where love was rationed, where fear was policy, a state that created warriors, but no thinkers, no builders, no visionaries. Its victories were temporary, its walls paper thin, its power dependent on keeping the majority enslaved. The moment that balance shifted, it was over. And yet, the world remembers Sparta as immortal, because we don't like the idea that strength can die. We want to believe that if we're strong enough, we're safe. Sparta is proof that's a lie. It wasn't a kingdom of heroes. It was a machine, one that consumed its own people until there was nothing left to feed on. Or so if we strip away the armor, the myth collapses, and what's left isn't glory. It's a warning, one that history has been shouting for centuries, and one we keep ignoring. Imagine a modern Sparta. No freedom of speech, no individuality, every child claimed by the state. Your friends assigned, your job decided before you're grown, your body a resource for the nation. Dissent is treason, poverty is permanent, empathy is weakness. You're told you're part of something greater, but that something exists only to fight, to consume, to survive. Technology wouldn't save you. It would only make control tighter, surveillance replacing the cryptia, propaganda replacing ritual. The state wouldn't care if you were happy, only if you were useful. And the moment you weren't, you'd be erased, quietly, efficiently. That's the truth behind the fantasy. Living in Sparta wasn't about glory. It was about enduring pain, enduring loss, enduring the knowledge that you existed only to serve. And in the end, even Sparta couldn't endure itself. Sparta is gone, the land is quiet, the shields are buried, the names mostly forgotten. But the story, that still walks. We remember the warriors, the sacrifice, the walls of shields under the sun. We forget the chains, the fear, the lives ground to dust so the few could stand tall. Sparta teaches us one thing worth keeping, that courage matters. But courage without compassion is just another word for cruelty. So when leaders speak of unity, ask what they mean. When they demand sacrifice, ask who benefits. When they praise strength, look for the cost. Because somewhere out there, someone is already building the next Sparta, and they'll call it great. The question is, will we believe them?